Okay, welcome in. Getting ready for Pitt-Clemson. It's a big game this weekend. A bit of a step up in competition for Pitt after facing Florida State and Virginia Tech in back-to-back games. And we're joined now by Larry Williams from TigerIllustrated.com. And Larry, we're taping this on Tuesday, and I just want to talk about the game. That's the big storyline. But here earlier in the week, there's a little bit of a different storyline going on with Clemson's game against Florida State being postponed this past weekend due to some COVID issues. Pitt got brought up sort of tangentially by Dabo Swinney. I guess my question to you, and you and I talked a little bit before we started recording, but Dabo seems to be speaking strongly this week, and I know he's been asked about it, and that sort of draws the comments out. But what's been your take on it? Some people have said that he's been making a heel turn this year or something. I mean, what are we seeing different sides of Dabo Swinney in the last 6 to 8 months, or even the last couple of days?
Well, I think you have to sort of confine it to this incident right now. I don't think there's a common thread, with how he's responded to, different things. I think the big issue with this was that, and I don't even know for sure that as of Saturday morning, after the game had been postponed and they're making arrangements to head back to Clemson, I don't know that Dabo or Dan Radakovich, the AD, were really planning on saying much more than what they said in their statements that were released on Saturday morning with the news that the game had been postponed. I think that when they saw Mike Norvell on game day, by the way, Dabo was given the same opportunity and declined Saturday morning. But when you see sort of these notions emanating from Florida State-based media, that these implications that Clemson was kind of playing fast and loose, and Clemson was, a symptomatic player boarded the plane to Tallahassee, and that Clemson practiced all week with a symptomatic player. Clearly that's the belief on the Florida State side, I would guess, but Clemson vehemently denies a good bit of that stuff. Their timeline more indicates that they had a symptomatic player early in the week who then did not practice, who then was tested multiple times, and then who then tested negative and then was allowed back with the team and sort of cleared, so to speak. And then only Friday night, after they had gotten to Tallahassee, did his test come back positive, and that's when they went through the normal procedures of isolating him and making plans to get him back to Clemson. So I think that the main reason you saw Dabo jump on top of a table Sunday night was because there were things out there being sort of perpetuated that really angered him. I think that Clemson has been very above board this whole time, and I think impressively so. Specifically in the case of Trevor Lawrence being held from the Notre Dame game. There are a lot of coaches out there who could have resisted the advice of the medical representatives with their team in that case, and who could have said, you know what, he'll be fine. He feels fine. Let's just go and play him. He could have, if he wanted to, Dabo could have turned it into a PR war, between the pro-play Trevor people in the medical community. He did not do that. He immediately said, you know what, I'm trusting our medical people. And it was a week before the Notre Dame game, even like immediately after the Boston College game, when Dabo announced that, hey, Trevor's going to be out for Notre Dame, and that's that. And so anyway, my point in saying all that is that Dabo and Clemson, I think, have a good bit of money in the bank, so to speak, when it comes to how they've handled mitigation and the seriousness with which they've taken the virus. And so I think that really he felt that that Clemson was really being sort of challenged in that respect, and he was going to stand up for their practices with how they've handled it in general, and then also specific to that, in asserting in his mind that they did nothing wrong and they followed every protocol that existed. I think it's fair to say, hey, well, it's a third string offensive lineman. Was it the smartest thing in the world to sign off on him making the trip? Why not just leave him at home? Well, I mean, that's a fair point, but that's also said with the benefit of hindsight, because you have numerous players who, not just with Clemson but everywhere, who have some symptoms and they test negative, and then they go on and proceed with practicing and playing. And so I think it's easy to sort of sit back now and say, oh, they should have just left the player at home to avoid any sort of problems to begin with. But I think in the moment, I don't think it was a terrible decision.
Right. I guess.
And as to why this is continuing, I think from last night he was on his coach's radio show, and so fans were asking him about it, calling in, and so that is why you saw last night more stuff coming from him. And then today in his press conference, he didn't come in with talking points. He wanted to further get off of his chest. It was more that he was asked about what Mike Norvell said yesterday, and so that's what's made this thing continue to burn. So I would think that, and don't hold me to it, but I would think that now it's maybe mostly over, and that he will, truly turn the focus to Pitt in terms of, if he gets any more questions about it, my guess is going to be like, hey guys, I've already said my piece, so it's time to talk about Pittsburgh.
Right. There's no concern that this would be a distraction for the team, right?
He says no. And hey, this team's ready to play. This team was raring to go this past Saturday, and so of course not. They've been waiting 3 weeks. Since the Notre Dame loss, it will have been come Saturday. But I think anytime something so jolting and something just throws you so far out of your comfort zone as this, I mean, they're about to get on the buses to go to the game. Right. And then it's like, there's no game. And so I think anytime something like that happens, anytime the controversy continues, into the week, which it absolutely has. I mean, those players aren't in they're not in a cocoon. I mean, they're on social media as well. And so they're living it also. So I don't think, I don't think you could say that there's been zero distraction, and that it hasn't been something they've had to, address in a concerted way just to make sure they move past it. So it's just, like I said, it's just something where it's kind of consumed everybody. And so I think there's going to be some natural distraction that comes with that.
Right. I guess, kind of the last thing on that subject, in your opinion, what's the best answer here? You know what I mean? If you have the doctors on each side saying different things, having different recommendations, I think Paul Feinbaum said the ACC should have stepped in. John Swofford should have made a ruling. Does he overrule the doctors? Is there an ACC medical team that should step in? In your opinion, as a guy who's covered the ACC for a long time, what is the best solution? And it's obviously a unique situation. What's the best solution?
Yeah. I think in hindsight, I think both sides would probably agree maybe they should have spent more time talking to each other, maybe face to face. In hindsight, the ACC, I think it's fair to say, maybe Swofford himself should have stepped in and said, okay, wait a minute, let's hit pause and maybe do another round of testing. Clemson is willing to stay until Sunday or even Monday. They're down here in Tallahassee. Let's try to get this game in. Florida State, any team can say, we don't feel comfortable playing, and they're not going to make you play. This is the COVID era. It's just like with, coming into the season, the coaches everywhere said, we're not going to make our players play. They're all free to, if they don't feel safe, no questions asked, we'll honor your scholarship, best of luck. And so I think the same principle applies to how the ACC or any conference handles it when a team decides that it doesn't feel safe enough to play. I do think that what elevates this to a situation where the commissioner, I think, needs to step in and not necessarily make a ruling, but mediates. It's I don't want to be crude, but it's a pissing match. And I think if it's not like one side said we don't feel safe playing, and the other side said, well, we're ready to play, but we're going to honor that decision and end it at that. I mean, one side is basically accusing the other of basically punting on the game and using COVID as an excuse,
right.
And so that's ugly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you were to hypothesize in the SEC, if Alabama and Auburn were going through this, how quickly would Greg Sankey have stepped in and been a mediator and said something? I think very quickly. And so I think it's totally fair to say that John Swofford or somebody at the ACC should have done something sooner. But I don't think there's any like written protocol that says in the event that one team doesn't feel safe playing that the commissioner has to step in and say, well, we don't care. You need to play anyway because this isn't really a danger to you. I just don't think that the guidelines are set up that way.
And they probably shouldn't be. To your point, right. I mean, they probably shouldn't be. I mean, if you don't feel comfortable playing, you don't feel like it's safe, you shouldn't be commanded to play. But I think you make a good point about mediation, though. I mean, you need to step in and bring people to the table, bring doctors to the table, and say, all right, let's find a resolution here. If it's playing today, it's playing tomorrow, whatever it is, and not leave it the way it is. And I'm surprised, and I would be surprised if there hasn't been more communication in the last few days. You know what I mean, between the conference and these schools. So,
and I'll say too, one thing that is perplexing is, and Dabo brought this up Sunday night. These coaches have been meeting on a weekly basis since March, and the conference established the protocol that they allowed for the increase in travel rosters from 72 to 80 with this precise scenario in mind. Scenario being you get to your destination and your final round of testing for the week produces one or more positive tests. So therefore you've got to ship one or more guys home, and then you have to be able to compensate for that with your roster. So therefore you have more guys to choose from, to cushion that attrition. And so to Dabo's point, where I really see his point most of all is it's not like this is some crazy situation that nobody anticipated, and I dare say that in other games there have been positive tests that have been revealed either the day before the game or the day of the game, and that hasn't shut everything down. I mean, they planned for this, is Dabo's point. And I think one of the things that ticks him off the most is what is the value of testing if you don't sort of abide by what those tests say and then what the protocols say in terms of, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but anybody who tests positive on a Friday has been practicing and with the team previously, right? So surely that situation has come up numerous times already, and they've been able to stop short of canceling or postponing the game. So
yeah, it's I mean, it's all unprecedented, obviously. I mean, we've never been through a year like this, and I mean, the cancellations and postponements is pretty it's like I said, it's unprecedented. It's a unique situation. But let's actually talk football for a little bit here, if we could get to the game that's going to be played this this Saturday. And, obviously Clemson had the loss to Notre Dame. That's not really a comparison point for me, because when Pitt played Notre Dame, they lost 45-3. So, I mean, it's not like I'm going to look at and say, what did Notre Dame do that slowed Clemson down or changed the outcome of that game? I will go back before that, though, to the Boston College game, which, Clemson ends up winning. It's a lot closer than maybe a lot of people expected. When you look at that game, what was Boston College able to do against Clemson? Do you put a lot of it just on having a new starting quarterback, or were there certain things Boston College was able to take advantage of, or certain, approaches and sort of attacks that they were able to use to keep that game as close as it was?
The two things that sort of the thread of the last couple of games has been the absence of some really key players for Clemson's defense. Tyler Davis, the defensive tackle, and then James Skalski, the middle linebacker. There are many more injuries that have happened. I mean, they were dropping like flies against Notre Dame, but the main ones have been those two right up the middle of the defense. And so, I think that against both Notre Dame and Boston College, they weren't able to get much pressure on the quarterbacks. And so you saw in the first half against Boston College, the Eagles went up and down the field, mainly through the air. And then against Notre Dame, Ian Book was able to use his legs to really make stuff happen, and making throws when the pocket broke down, and then scrambling free for a good number of rushing yards. And so that's really been the biggest concern. Tyler Davis has been easily one of the most valuable players on this team so far, in that he didn't play against Virginia early in the season, and Virginia was able to put together quite a few drives and some points. But then a week later, he came back against Miami, and they were dominant on defense and shutting down pretty much everything Miami tried to do. And so, you fast forward to more recently, Boston College and Notre Dame, they just have not had that ability to push the pocket into the quarterback's lap. The quarterbacks have been able to step up and make throws. Davis is expected back for this game. I don't know for sure if he would have played against Florida State. I think that was maybe going to be like a game time decision. I would assume he's going to play this week, but not 100% certain. And then Skalski is definitely out. So they do get back Mike Jones, who's the nickel Sam linebacker, who is another fairly key piece, who's been out the last couple of games. Behind him is a true freshman, Trenton Simpson, who had to play 75 snaps against Notre Dame. I mean, linebackers in Brent Venables' defense as freshmen hardly ever play significant snaps, and the fact that he had to play 75 that night really tells you sort of where they are right now in terms of how thin that defense is. So I would say that on the defensive side of the ball, that pretty much sums it up. And then on offense, Clemson's offensive line has kind of struggled of late. I mean, they ran for 34 yards against Notre Dame, which was their lowest total since 2011. Dabo would say, well, in the RPO era, the quick passing game should be counted as runs too, because when teams defenses take away, your running back, then we just dump it out. That should be, counted with the run as well. But I mean, the fact of the matter is they haven't run the ball like they want to run it with Travis Etienne, who might be the best player in the country. And so that's really one of the biggest negatives of them not playing last week, was that offensive line needed sort of a get-right game after Notre Dame. And Pittsburgh's defensive line is not that type of get-right game. They're just really, really good by all accounts. And so I think this is going to be a monster test for Clemson's offensive line on Saturday.
They haven't done a great job establishing the run, but what about pass protection, though? I mean, I see the stats that rushing is not a strength of the team, but in the 6 games when Trevor Lawrence played, they averaged like 48 points per game. So they're obviously still doing something right. Are they doing a good job protecting the quarterback?
Yeah, they've done a fantastic job of protecting. That's really been kind of, the dichotomy with the offensive line is that running the ball, their interior has been pretty inconsistent. But then passing wise, they've really done well all year. From my perspective. So yeah, you're right. They're doing some things right if they're scoring 48 points a game. So I don't mean to sound like too negative about what's going on offense. I'm just trying to give more of a window into, as they, looking at the big picture of this team getting back to where it's used to going and challenging for and maybe winning a national championship. Offensive line and the running game in particular is absolutely where they need to make the most gains, I think.
Sure. Pitt fans always still look back to that 2016 game, which, I mean, really doesn't bear any, you know what I mean? It doesn't have any relevance to this year's game. But when you look at how Pitt was able to pull that off, I mean, 3 interceptions by Deshaun Watson goes a long way, particularly when a couple of them are down close to the end zone. Not that Deshaun Watson was necessarily prone to mistakes, but Trevor Lawrence really seems to be good at avoiding making mistakes. Is there any concern with Russ, though? Because as you said, it's been has it been a month now since he's played?
It will have been more than a month since he played against Syracuse. That's his last game. So yeah, I think obviously he's as good as any player in the country. Probably the best quarterback in the country. But anytime you've missed that long, that has to be at least a little bit of a concern, particularly when you're going up against a defense that is so formidable, and when the guys in front of you, have been so inconsistent at run blocking. I think that's definitely a valid concern for sure.
You talked about a little bit the injuries on defense. Schematically, remind us a little bit of Brent Venables' defense and what they try to do, particularly against the pass. I mean, that's where Pitt's strength is. They can't really run the ball very well, but even last week against Virginia Tech, it's just 7-8 yards, kind of dink and dunk their way down the field. And rhythm passing game. Is this defensive system, not just the talent, but the system, susceptible to something like that? And how does he tend to attack? You see more man, zone? What do you tend to see out of this defense?
Well, you see everything from Brent Venables. Just the kitchen sink approach, and not necessarily blitzing 6 guys every play. It's more along the lines of where the guys are coming from. He can bring 4 or 5, but you have no idea. One play it could be the linebacker screaming through the A gap off of a twist or a loop or something, or it could be the cornerback coming, or the safety coming from center field. And so I think just the unpredictable part of that is the bear kind of that comes with trying to face a Brent Venables defense. But like I mentioned earlier, they've had trouble getting disruption with their defensive line, and when that happens, the teeth of a blitz aren't as sharp, I guess, because it's just harder when you're not getting to the quarterback. Then that puts even more stress on your secondary, and they've had some issues in their secondary as well in coverage. And so I think this defense, they came into the year knowing they were going to have to grow up at some positions where you have some guys playing prominent roles for the first time. And then you add to that the attrition that has come in the form of injuries. And it's kind of like they're getting beaten up while they're growing up. And so that's kind of stunned that process a little bit. So, but I think statistically though, like if you look at the numbers, they're right where they normally are in terms of tackles for loss, sacks, even points allowed per game. I think it's like 19.5. If you took away all the non-defensive allowed touchdowns, there's been a pick six, there's been a couple of scoop scores. There's been a couple of instances of the offense giving up the ball deep in its own territory, so a short field touchdown. If you take all those away, I think it's like 48 points. And so if you subtracted that, they'd be right at like 13 points a game allowed. And I know every team out there has extenuating circumstances where you said if they didn't do this and that, but I'm just saying, like, statistically they're not that far off of where they've been in recent years.
Yeah, I was talking to someone earlier in the week, and we were talking about this game, and they're like, well, Clemson, their defense isn't what it's been before. I'm like, yeah. and personnel wise, and then I look at the stats. I'm like, oh, they're still the number 10 in total defense in the country, and still, top 15, top 20, because they're giving up less than 20 points per game. I'm like, yeah, doesn't seem like a huge, by the numbers at least, a huge fall off. Speaking of numbers, I think this game opened at maybe 26.5. Clemson minus 26.5. I think as of Tuesday, it's around 24.5. Overall, what do you see out of this game? I mean, do you see it being that substantial? I mean, Clemson certainly not new to having games that are sort of blowouts like that. Do you think that's probably how this one will go on Saturday?
When I hear that spread, I'm a little surprised. My gut tells me that it'll be more narrow than that. But when you think about it, you could sort of envision a scenario where it's kind of a back and forth game, and going into the third quarter, Clemson's up 10, 13, and then they tack on one or two scores late. So I'm interested. I think Pitt is a solid team, and as both Dabo and Brent Venables have mentioned in the last couple of days, when Pickett has been out has been when Pitt has struggled, and when he's in there, they're a pretty tough out. And so I just look at it as this is a, when they're going to play Florida State, you're wondering if you're going to be able to stay awake, in the third quarter, because Clemson's going to be up by 45 points. This is a bit of a different story, I think. I'm intrigued by some of the different matchups, particularly on the line of scrimmage. Clemson has some developing to do on both sides of the ball, and I think Pitt is a worthy adversary in that respect with regard to that matchup.
This will be the third matchup between Pitt and Clemson in the last 5 years, and quite frankly, three very different Pitt teams. In 2016 was the Matt Canada offense that did all kinds of window dressing to try and mess with your defense, and I think it worked pretty well. 2018 in the ACC title game, it was a run-heavy offense, and this year's team is they want to throw the ball all over the place, and that's kind of the only thing they're good at offensively. So it'll be interesting. I think I don't know if it'll end up being, like you say, like maybe 4 touchdowns or anything like that, but it'll be an interesting game. I don't know. Pitt's very inconsistent up and down. But, Larry, unless you have any other thoughts on the game, I appreciate your time, man. I'm glad we could, catch up. And, hopefully – I guess the last thing we should say is hopefully this game happens. Pitt got postponed 2 weeks ago. Clemson got postponed last week. So hopefully everybody stays in and does what they're supposed to do. And, game goes off as scheduled.
For the last I heard from somebody down here who I think had talked to somebody at Pitt, was that they're in good shape. Is that what you're hearing as well?
Yeah, I mean they were good enough to play this past weekend, albeit with 16 guys sitting out. So unless it spreads beyond that, which I don't think. I think they should be on. With having a game postponed 2 weeks ago and then having a bunch of guys out this past week, you would think it's sort of on the trending down. Guys are getting to the end of the 10-day quarantine or the 2-week quarantine or whatever it may be. So they should. I mean, I don't think there should be any issues, but you never know. I feel like there was that post-Halloween peak that sort of happened across the country, and I think it hit the Pitt football team, which led to the postponement and being down so many guys this past week. But I think they should be in good shape, which they need. I mean, they were missing 3 starting offensive linemen, their leading receiver and leading tackler, which kind of makes the fact that they beat Virginia Tech by 30 a little bit more surprising. But they should be in decent shape, and hopefully Clemson doesn't have anything beyond. Is there any talk of any contact tracing or anything like that with the player who did test positive?
I don't think any related to him. I think there might be some minimal contact tracing from some other situations, but like I said, they had zero positive tests on Sunday. So that was, and that's not including the one who was positive on Friday. Right. So I think they're in good shape. So, but you never know. They're sort of every day is knocking on wood, I think, for every team out there this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you saw Clemson's game gets postponed on Saturday morning. Pitt's game 2 weeks ago got postponed on like late Thursday afternoon. This is how it goes. You never really know they're going to play a game until they actually kick off. So
that's right.
Happens on Saturday. But Larry, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. And assuming it happens, enjoy the game on Saturday.
Likewise. Happy Thanksgiving, Chris.
All right. Thanks. You too.